The Nachmund Gauntlet, full audiobook. Now this is the full expansion for the Crusade book, Nachmund Gauntlet, but I have to concede, it was exceptionally tricky in many regards, so please do forgive me if there is any element of infrequent clunkiness in the editing. Some of the names and English used were challenging, hence I beg your forgiveness. But I hope the sum is greater than the parts. Alas, I am only one man, and doing these long reads can be challenging. Now, let us find out about the ongoing story of the War Master's attempt to seize the Nachmund Gauntlet. To quote, Warhammer 40,000, the Nachmund Gauntlet. The claiming of Sanguiterra. Haarken felt the Desolator-class battleship's activity as it prepared for the next warp translation, akin to a warrior's ritualized measures before battle, the throb of its plasma engines, the creak of millennia-aged stanchions, the noise and smell of tens of thousands of crew, all reverberated in every part of the Scourge of Stars, even the private sanctum from which Haarken orchestrated the gathering of his armada. The herald of the apocalypse paced like a caged animal. He moved from one vid-screen's sickly glow to another, inspecting each with predatory glares. Haarken snatched up data slates, absorbing their contents in the space of 2 strides, the stamp of his boots ringing from blood-stained deck plates before discarding them. He stalked from rune-crusted Vox relay to holographic sector display to analysis cogitator, accessing Vox channels to deliver his commands and make his demands. In contrast to his ceaseless movement, his words were sparing monosyllabic rasps. The herald's oratory was a legendary weapon, but it was one he knew when best to keep sheathed. Around Haarken, reports in harsh voices bled from multiple Vox feeds, clashing with earlier recordings. Binaric signals streamed from banks of strategic instrumentation, the noise echoing from the sanctum's clutter. Caskets, display cabinets, and grotesque pedestals clustered around the walls, holding a portion of Haarken's collection of dark knowledge. To the chamber's rear hulked the slab of a desk, and behind it a command throne, the embedded controls cold, ignored, and unused. And Haarken despised the kind of sedentary bureaucrat who hid behind a desk. A prodigious hololith dais rose like a stepped ziggurat at the sanctum's center. Its flanks were dense with incised cuneiform sigils. Oversized power feeds and cabling led to more esoteric supplies which studded its basal structure. Frost rimmed the sanctum's deck plates around the dais's edge. Scourge of Stars was not alone in the void. Thousands of ships gathered in Haarken's flock. They moored across a swathe of anchorages throughout the Jestine system, whose death scars he knew still burned. Firestorms roared across savage continents on its 3 worlds, fed by continued violent detonations as the carcasses of the planet's defense fleet fell into decaying orbits and hit the surface in eruptions of plasma from breached reactors. Yoking such an immense force and balancing the obsessions of hundreds of warlords, some of who were ill used to serving, was complex and required a hand that was manipulative, firm, and swiftly brutal. Even now, several amongst his armada, believing their own lies that they were above the War Master's command, spun plots to overthrow Haarken and seize control of the gathering fleets for themselves. Most could be managed, Haarken knew. He had many tools in his arsenal for bending recalcitrant narcissists to his will, but there were others whose plotting he had already decided to put a permanent end to. As if drawn to his unspoken thoughts, a priority signal he had been waiting for chimed amidst the clamour of voices and data streams. Haarken opened the channel immediately. "Speak," he grated. "The connection is made," reported Moshka Vane, The sorcerer's voice was strained. "My cabal must relay now, or risk losing it." "Await security," Haarken snapped. He severed the channel to Vane and opened another. "Seal this sanctum," he commanded. "My Lord Haarken, of course," came the tremulous voice of Scourge of Stars' Voxmaster. The weakling was new in their post, and made the mistake of continuing to speak. "We will begin the entreaty of the machine spirits, although there are priority signals waiting." "Now!" Haarken didn't shout, but he pitched the intensity of his voice in a manner that thrust his will through the Vox network. Around him, multiple emitters echoed the word, each with subtly different cadences laced with distinct threats. Feedback howled. From the Voxmaster's channel, he heard wails of distress, as waves of psycho-oral compulsion forced several officers to painfully regurgitate the word again and again, whispering, pleading, and shouting it at the Voxmaster. "No, no, no!" sobbed the Voxmaster, the word having taken over their feeble mind. Haarken severed the Vox channel. The others shut down in ragged flurries. He heard heavy locks engage and ancient psi baffles descend around the sanctum as the Voxmaster forced multiple systems into action, shielding him from the outside. With Haarken's sanctuary secure against everything save the sorcerer's mystic link, he signaled Vane to commence. He turned to the colossal hololith dais, stalking to take his place before it, as he sensed power flooding it. Finally, Haarken stopped, stilling himself as he stared at the rising glow. There was only one for which the Worldclaimer halted. The form of Abaddon the Despoiler cohered at the speed of thought. There was no tremulous glitching or stuttering of the holographic figure as Haarken was used to. The Worldclaimer bowed his head, the gesture of submission symbolic in these circumstances. However, he was not entirely sure that, even formed merely of techno-sorcerer's light, the Despoiler could not reach out and break him in two. "How fares the gauntlet?" Abaddon demanded. His voice was a powerful growl that seemed to seep from the dais' stepped stonework, every syllable sending crawling sparks of empiric power through the carved sigils. "The Justine system burns, Lord. With it, the fortress of Nonavor. It is the last to face our assembled might," Haarken said. He gestured with a taloned finger at the hololithic sector display. Abaddon had the display's twin aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the two linked by a symbiotic empiric parasite to ensure everything Haarken indicated Abaddon would also see. "Save a handful of squadrons deployed to hunt down fleeing survivors, the Armada is almost fully gathered here. We are preparing for mass translation. We will leave the Nachmund Gauntlet and arrive in the Gandal Subsector within weeks." Abaddon's eyes appeared to stare beyond Haarken for a moment, before flicking directly back to him. It required effort for the Herald of the Apocalypse to meet the stare. "What is left? What blades are at your back?" Haarken knew Abaddon meant those places within the Nachmund Gauntlet that Worldclaimer had bypassed, prioritizing speed and broad conquest over diverting towards every Imperial world. Frontier worlds, void patrols believing they have hidden themselves, Xenos pirates. As Haarken spoke, vector glyphs and status sigils altered color and shape, spouting halos of additional data. "There is no Imperial strength left in the Gauntlet, or anything with the power to delay us, Warmaster. I have factors in place to deal with each one. Mercenaries for some, seeded mortal armies ready to be triggered, or splinters of the Vanguard for others." "The rest of your Vanguard," Abaddon said, barely making a question of the statement. "Already embedded amongst the worlds of the Coronal Subsector. They have been effective and efficient." Haarken breathed slowly, while he waited for Abaddon's reaction to his preparedness. Finally, he asked what had most been on his mind. "What of VIGILUS, Lord?" Abaddon's bulk didn't appear to move, but Haarken felt more focus fall on him. He held his nerve, confident that he was worthy of such scrutiny. "Nothing can stop VIGILUS's fall now. No relief force can reach it. It is mine." Haarken felt a surge of vindication at the thought. He remembered how he had claimed the world by thrusting his demon-touched spear into its surface. "Now, the Nachmund Gauntlet is also mine," Abaddon continued. "It is a path, perhaps the greatest of those paved, but not the only one." Haarken felt such tremendous presence force its way into proximity, sweeping aside thoughts of VIGILUS burning. Behind him, signal indicators flashed for his attention. Abaddon lifted a hand, staring hard at Haarken. In the Despoiler's giant palm hovered the representation of a void ship. Haarken could not see details, but its silhouette was unmistakable. It was monstrous, a manifestation of the will to conquer the galaxy at any cost. "You will shatter the spirit of the Gandal system. You will break their defenses. You will seize Sanctuary and make it a staging point for conquest. You will claim it in my name." Haarken Worldclaimer dropped to one knee and bent his head. His taloned gauntlet held out. The hololithic representation of the immense ship passed from Abaddon's hand to Haarken's in a way that was impossible. Beyond the sealed sanctum, the planet killer emerged from the warp. Paths of Ruination. The Nachmund Gauntlet. When the Great Rift, also known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, tore open, it bisected the galaxy with a seemingly impenetrable gulf of warp storms. Yet when the turmoil of the Noctis Aeterna subsided, several passages of relative sanity were discovered through the rift. The Nachmund Gauntlet is the most stable of those found so far. It is a large and crooked channel of space, light years across and many more in length, that stretches from the VIGILUS system in the galactic northeast to the Sanguis system in the southwest. Within its bounds are numerous planetary systems, piratical haunts, Xenos enclaves, and isolated deep void station networks. The stability and safety of the Nachmund Gauntlet are relative only to the terrible dangers of the Great Rift that churn and boil about the channel's fringes. The Gauntlet's tortured edges are a liminal zone of continually shifting empiric energies, where the ferocious warp storms of the Great Rift ebb and flow in unfathomable rhythms. Those whose systems lie near the Gauntlet's edge endure a perilous existence. Surges of destructive power occasionally consume entire worlds whose populaces had thought themselves blessed to survive the Great Rift's opening. At other times, the storms recede. They may pull back from ruined worlds to which reckless looters flock, spit out ravaged flotillas orphaned from once mighty fleets, or reveal expanses of empty real space that charts claim once held bustling stellar systems. No warp travel is without risk. To dare even the safest of warp routes along the Nachmund Gauntlet, however, is to gamble a ship's structure and its crew's souls amidst an ever-changing froth of tidal sinkholes, empiric anomalies, and unstable Geller nodes. All but the most fearless or deranged shipmasters are forced to make limited warp jumps, translating back into real space numerous times. Even within the bounds of real space, the Nachmund Gauntlet is dangerous. The proximity of the Great Rift causes gravitic fluctuations and powers of obscuring radiation. The rift is an ever-present stain whose emanations can cause insanity and mutation. The Gauntlet also harbors dangerous and uncompromising inhabitants, ready to prey upon any ships that stray too near their lairs. Amongst the most widely feared are the pirates, renegades, and fanatics who inhabit the fractal region known as the Coraplex, as well as the fallen nobles who haunt the routes near their home world of Daravar. As dangerous as the Nachmund Gauntlet is, no other route is known by which huge war fleets can pass between the Imperium Nihilus and the Imperium Sanctus in comparative security. Whether this vital conduit of real space is one of salvation or death now hangs in the balance. the Gandal Subsector. What remains of the Gandal Subsector lies at the mouth of the Nachmund Gauntlet, at its Imperium Sanctus end. When the Great Rift yawned wide, half of the subsector systems were consumed. The unnatural plagues, mutations, and nightmarish phenomena that afflicted the surviving systems were endured thanks largely to the efforts of Daravar Talon, planetary governor of Sanguis Terra in the Sanguis system, with its sister systems of Jagal, Corex, and Leonid. The Sanguis system formed a cordon at the mouth of the newly discovered Nachmund Gauntlet. Initially a hub to supply forces securing the Gauntlet and distant VIGILUS, Gandal systems would become a new frontier in a war of survival. Transmissions Intelligence. Inquiry Reference 5091/358 HEPT. Conquest of the Gauntlet. Juncture 8795536.003. The Sanguis Flare. Governor Toll and the Sanguis Terra War Council she institutes are denied resources by Sector Command to establish an ironclad fortress at the mouth of the Nachmund Gauntlet. The Sanguis, Jagal, Corex, and Leonid systems support each other while attempting to comply with Sector Command's orders. They are already overstretched when disaster strikes. A warp flare from the Great Rift envelops the entire Sanguis system. Though the flare is short-lived, the consequences are dire. Swathes of Sanguis Terra are saturated with empiric energy. Mutations and nightmares are rife. The planet's moon, Sigil, is transformed into a hideous citadel from which demonic legions invade Sanguis Terra and nearby worlds. Juncture 882144.017. The War of Nightmares. Imperial armies on the hive worlds of VIGILUS are already fighting multiple Xenos threats when Haarken Worldclaimer reveals his presence and exploits the anarchy. He heralds the arrival of Abaddon the Despoiler and an armada of heretics. Abaddon's armies surge across VIGILUS's hive sprawls on the brink of swiftly overwhelming the world. A strategy negotiated between Chapter Master Marnes Kalgar and a host of Asuyani results in the sabotage of the Despoiler's flagship and draws him away from the war, but almost costs Kalgar his life. The majority of Abaddon's armies remain. The Great Rift appears to grow closer, and VIGILUS's existence hangs in the balance. Juncture 904730.741. The Halo Wrought. Abaddon's fleets strike at other systems around the northern mouth of the Gauntlet. Refugees and surviving forces converge on VIGILUS, seeing the world as a desperate haven despite the battles raging there. Rumour turns Kalgar's fall into a legendary death, the fact of his survival lost in the fog of war. To some, he is hailed as a saint, and when a defiled cathedral is recaptured on the moon of Hearthlak, it is rededicated in Kalgar's honour. Hearthlak's damaged atmosphere processes pump out a toxic haze, forming a golden halo around the VIGILUS system that appears to hold back the Great Rift. The sight fuels greater zealotry, and, in its midst, the manifestation of Celestine. The living saint is hailed as nothing less than a miracle of the god Emperor. Juncture 952814.002. The Coronal War. Amongst the eldritch tools in Abaddon's arsenal at VIGILUS are the Noctilus crowns. His ritualists raise them across the system's planets, using them to summon the Great Rift's energies into real space and causing nightmares to manifest into reality. Inquisitor Catavalonus, having secretly monitored the VIGILUS system for some time, vows to see them broken. Through force of will and terrifyingly explicit threats, the demon hunter forges a grand army from the remains of several forces. With their sacrifice to pave his way, Catavalonus severs a central node of the Noctilus Crown's network and seals a warp gate feeding empiric power onto the world. Juncture 980202 .033. The Siege of Daravar. More of Abaddon's armies pour onto VIGILUS after other systems fall. The planet is more isolated than ever. On Abaddon's orders, Haarken Worldclaimer leaves the failing planet, commanding 1,000-strong fleet to seize control of the Nachmund Gauntlet. On Daravar, the Chaos Knights of House Mandracore defend their mountain citadels against a huge Imperial force led by Chapter Master Bastion Defense of the Castellans of the Rift Chapter. Though caring little for the Chaos Knights, Haarken recognizes the besiegers as the greatest concentration of Imperial might in the Gauntlet. He breaks Grix's army upon the anvil of Daravar, smashing them between his forces and House Mandracore. Juncture 989400.097. The Battle of the Narrow. Piecemeal attacks and factional disunity slow the plunge of Haarken's fleet down the Nachmund Gauntlet, but its progress is inevitable. Admiral Priska assembles a mismatched fleet to interrupt the Chaos Armada to buy time for Imperial reinforcements to reach the Gauntlet's southern mouth. At the Grikilioid Narrow, she masterminds a stunning ambush. Priska's fleet cars through the Chaos ships, destroying or crippling large numbers in a battle that her captains manage to extend for hours. Priska's ships are overwhelmingly outnumbered, however, and ultimately doomed. Haarken's mammoth armada scuttles them one by one. A few ragged survivors flee to take the new south. Juncture 991605.862. The Fall of Celestine. Upon VIGILUS, Celestine inspires tens of thousands of weary militia and soldiers to pave the path of her first victory at Saint's Haven with their martyrdom. She pushes on at the head of a force of battle sisters of the Order of the Bloody Rose, leading the purge of Dontoria Hivespawn, which had been infected with a supernatural taint. After days of fighting, the continent-sized city burns. When Celestine finally emerges from Dontoria's borders, she advances from one district to another, galvanizing flagging Imperial holdouts and driving onwards to wherever she is needed. At Mortwald, Celestine races to the aid of Inquisitor Cartavalonas, whom the Black Legion sorcerer Zagramothis hunts. The sorcerer sacrifices his Black Legionaries to summon a trio of giant demons and their grotesque hosts. The Inquisitor's elite warriors die in swathes, their cordon shrinking as he calls for extraction shuttles. Celestine descends into the demonic throng as a spear flung from the heavens. Battle sisters, space marines, and dropships follow her lead, pushing back the tides of filth around her. The first demon lord wilts before Celestine's righteous glare and burns at her touch. She evades the second's heavy blows before carving its skull in two with the ardent blade. The third's fury is elemental. As Celestine duels the beast, its anger opens fissures around Mortwald, consuming demons and mortals in gouts of infernal energy. Cartavalonas witnesses the supernatural duelists from his rising dropship before a swathe of Mortwald disappears in an empiric eruption. Nothing escapes, not even the living saint. The conflagration is backlit by the stain of the great rift visible in the sky. The Inquisitor escapes VIGILUS with the seed of a theory and a conviction to reach Sanguine Terra. Juncture 991110.765. The Gauntlet Divided. Word of Haarken Worldclaimer's advance reaches the Gandal Subsector, not only via fitful astropathic messages, but also brought by refugees fleeing the onslaught. These survivors are processed with undue haste, enabling Abaddon's agents to slip through on errands of sabotage, insurrection, and assassination. Imperial reinforcements trickle into the region, and Sector Command finally acts. In the face of necessity, they abandon plans to support or evacuate the more distant half of the Gauntlet. Dozens of systems, including VIGILUS, are now on their own. Sector Command designates the four systems of Sanguis, Jagal, Coryx, and Leonid as a Sanctus Wall. What was a supply hub is turned into an interstellar fortress. Battlegroot Lamdax of Fleet Secundus is only days away when, unheralded, Junith Eruita and a war of faith reaches the Sanguis system. The Sanctus Wall's defences grow by the day, but they may not be enough against the flood that is about to break upon them. The Sanctus Wall. Free citizens of Leonid, rejoice! Know ye that salvation approaches our efficient and loyal system. Know ye that the rumours of faithlessness and despair circling Badawin, our vigorous and staunch brother world, will burn to ash in the light of the Emperor's truth. Already do Badawin's underwater cities sing praises that reverberate through the northern ocean, grateful to host regiments of the Marder Cannoneers and Harklander Aquilae. Gladly housed and provisioned by the thankful of Badawin, these troops have crushed heretical riots and intercepted profiteer convoys. Nor are they alone, for Badawin's own defence militias has swelled in response to the refinery depot's general schemes of indenture. What threats remain, cowardly, heretical, or the product of reckless imagination? Let their worthless and deluded supporters know this: your judgment approaches. 3 days, Leonid Standard. In 3 days will the worlds of Badawin be liberated from doubt, terror, and plague. In his infinite wisdom, the God Emperor, through his appointed vessels of the Sanguiterran War Council, has seen fit to guarantee the arrival of a surfeit of indomitable armies. Marvel at only a fraction of them as follows. Strike Force Bargus, the Emperor's own Angels of the Rift Stalkers chapter, was hailed with a fanfare from 36 shrine cities upon its departure for Badawin. The Sanctum 98th Division, Grim Pilgrims, includes infantry and armoured regiments from Scarano, Threld, and Krieg, amongst others. The red skulls of their campaign badges are promise of death to the heretics on Badawin. Inspired by a vision of Badawin's dignity, the procession of redemption marches to its aid. 9 preceptories of the Order of our Martyred Lady and 4 lances from House Cadmus and House Terrin are at the procession's forefront, bearing sacred banners ready to plant on every purified refinery rig. By order of the Sanguiterran War Council, Divisio Bellum Optimizio. The race to fortify and supply the systems of the Sanctus Wall, following its belated formation by Sector Command, occupied the stim-fueled waking hours of an army of logistical adepts. Each world of the wall stockpiled resources, erected barracks and communication relays, and built temporary starports to accommodate the tide of armies and refugees that amassed in their orbits. Costly accords were struck with kin of several leagues of Votan, with Vorskillis Oathband and several prophets of the Long Pit kindred from the Greater Thurian League, having vowed to aid Imperial armies in the battles to come. The systems of neighbouring subsectors, more distant from the Nachmund Gauntlet's mouth, were stripped to feed the Sanctus Wall's needs. Populations and equipment, food and Medicaid supplies, defence militias, newly raised Astromilitarum regiments, even orbital gun emplacements and bastion walls that had stood in place for centuries. These and more were uprooted and shifted to the Sanctus Wall. Many of these deprived worlds were made vulnerable in the process. Raids by pirates, armed uprisings by insurgent cults, and civil unrest triggered by privation were all duly noted by Sector Command and then ignored. Such appalling tragedies paled in the face of the horrors about to pour from the Nachmund Gauntlet. The worlds of the Sanctus Wall itself were not spared such disasters. In the Jagal system, the planets of Moroch and Marduk seethed with revolts. These were exploited by regiments of soldiers newly stationed there, who revealed their traitorous colours within days. Adeptus Ministorum bishops from Aurorae in the Choric system broadcast auto-hymnals over immense vox networks to remind the populace of their duty. On the night-bound world of Dark Pit and amongst the macro-granaries of Bount, mutant colonies and sabotage-plotting heretics had to be rooted out and purged. The Leonid system's penal world of Erediz saw its population of prisoners shrink day by day, as Governor Rosplatz worked them to death in her munitions factorums, while on Leopoldi, Inquisitor Anna Donesh uncovered a plot by a cabal of unsanctioned psychers in the Quarry World's mines. Inquisitorial agents, Navis Imperialis patrols, and rapid reaction forces also hunted down Xenos opportunists. Drukhari slavers harvested fresh specimens from isolated defense outposts, and even emptied ships waiting above the planet Encus to offload their human cargoes. Orc warbands, Kroot mercenaries, and Fraal hunters savaged vulnerable convoys, while the ore thieves of Orson's Oathband, declaimed as disreputable kin by Karl Vorskil, were excoriated by Ordo Xenos Inquisitors as fighting for Haarken Worldclaimer. Warlords of Sanguiterra. Haarken Worldclaimer, Herald of the Apocalypse. Haarken's orders from Abaddon the Despoiler were to conquer Sanguiterra and ready it to launch future campaigns deeper into the Imperium Sanctus, while also grinding down the Imperium's defences across all 4 of the Sanctum War's primary systems. Thousands of warships and millions of hate-filled warriors were at Haarken's command in the Gandal Subsector. He had planned the conquest of all 4 of its primary systems in detail, identifying targets to be seized, obliterated, or crippled. He had handed responsibility for these secondary theatres to the Dark Champions of Chaos Abaddon had given him command over. Sanguiterra's capital sprawl, however, would be his to claim. Haarken is a gifted killer and destroyer of enemy morale on huge and complex scales. His weaponizing of this strategy was embodied in his vanguard fleets. Ahead of his arrival, they sowed physical and spiritual corruption on its target worlds, seeding cults and misinformation, spreading terror and bloodshed. When Haarken struck, it would be at a foe already reeling. Zeren Nethtar, the Chainflayer. Nethtar the Chainflayer is a warlord of the Night Lord's Traitor Legion, a clawed nightmare who dives like a thunderbolt at midnight into his foes before tearing them apart with his talons. In Abaddon's push down the gullet of the Nachmund Gauntlet, Nethtar has seen opportunity for himself and his murderous warband, the Fear Rakers. They had plundered cities and orbital stations worth of munitions, fuel and other resources, and taken countless captives, including many Imperial psychers. Beyond the Gauntlet's mouth, Nethtar had sent still greater prizes. He and the Fear Rakers had proved their worth to Abaddon amidst the agonizing deaths of the Gauntlet's worlds. Amongst the Chainflayer's arsenal is a limited number of dread missiles, psycho-torment torpedo weapons, sealed in stasis aboard his flagship, the Hollow. He has sworn these to Abaddon's service. With them, he aims to buy greater prestige in the Despoiler's eyes and reap the rewards, especially if it means eclipsing other favoured champions to do so. Taurian Commodore, Daravar's Talon. Baron Commodore is a vicious fallen noble of the renegade house Mandracore. Commodore had long called on his rulers, the High King and High Queen, to strike out from their homeworld of Daravar and take the worlds of the Nachmund Gauntlet that are rightfully theirs. When an invading Imperial army and the Worldclaimer's host arrived at Daravar, Commodore saw a chance to increase Mandracore's power. Haarken's forces helped throw back the Imperial military, and in the battle's aftermath, Commodore pushed the High Monarchs to swear fealty to Abaddon. He then demanded lances of warriors with which to repay Mandragore's honor debt to Abaddon for saving Daravar. Over 100 Chaos Knights followed Commodore as he joined Haarken's armada. Amongst them is Countess Caliganus, an heir of Mandracore's rulers. The High Queen distrusts Commodore and sets her daughter to control him or oversee his conduct as she fights alongside him. Commodore knows Caliganus' role and intends to exploit it at the first opportunity. Junith Eruita, the Blazing Heart. Canoness Superior Eruita commands the Order of our Martyred Lady and fights a ceaseless battle of strategy and faith to coordinate their huge tallies of preceptories, commanderies, and shrine fortresses. Still, it is in battle that her intensity and passion most benefit the Imperial creed. She was a logical choice to lead the Ecclesiarch's war of faith to Sanguiterra. Miraculously arriving earlier than her adepts had expected, Eruita wasted no time installing her command staff throughout the cathedral of the Pyre Deified and the connected Strategium and Palace complex. While Eruita has been frustrated by the lack of martial and logistical support she saw at Sanguiterra, she was furious at the number of heretic cells, flares of mutation, and rumors of witchery she uncovered during her preparations to face the onslaught of heretic Astartes. She saw them as more than blasphemies. They were distractions and lures. She refused to rise to such bait and instead worked to marshal the capital Spall's defences. Erasmus Catavolonus, Ordo Malleus Inquisitor. Inquisitor Catavolonus and his ad hoc fleet had travelled nightmarish secret routes to reach Sanguiterra ahead of Haarken Worldclaimer's armada. The demon hunter still sees his nemesis as the Great Rift itself, but since escaping VIGILUS, he has mentally wrestled with conflicting courses of action. He needs more data before marching down a path from which he cannot turn back. On reaching Sanguiterra's surface, Catavolonus was disturbed to find its security protocols easily circumvented. Refugee barges, mass landers, and repurposed freight haulers offloaded their human cargoes with such haste that the spaceport's attempts at scrutiny were less than worthless, affecting a veneer of control that did not exist. He forced his way through at the Akrandor spaceport, sure that Abaddon's agents were already at work there. When Eruita landed, he presented himself to her, offering his forces to root out corruption. He prioritized making for the Tower of Murmuration and securing its astropaths. Arven Mardreth, Master of the Third. Master Nardreth commands the Guardians of the Covenant's 3rd Battle Company. A scholar and tactician of high standing amongst the chapters of the Unforgiven, Nardreth was amongst the highest-ranking Space Marines present on Sanguiterra at the time of Haarken's invasion, and his somber insights during Strategium conclaves were keenly sought by other commanders. The experienced Nardreth knew the combined Imperial might throughout Urban Sprawl Alpha would be sorely pressed against the armies that Sector Command believed were at Haarken's side. The Imperial relief forces were on their way to the planet, but they would be useless in orbit if Haarken's fleet blockaded the airspace over the capital region. To that end, Master Nardreth saw his primary duty as securing the immense orbital weapons of the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery. Only with those in Imperial hands could the forces embattled within the sprawl hope to blast a corridor through which salvation could reach them in time. Planet Killer. The Planet Killer was an awesomely powerful warship. As a symbol of Abaddon's brute strength, it forged a nightmarish reputation during his 12th Black Crusade, known to Imperial historians as the Gothic War. The core of the ship's notoriety lies with its colossal Armageddon gun, a multiple-barreled energy cannon of immeasurable magnitude. During the Gothic War, Abaddon used this weapon to bore through the crust of the cardinal world of Savaven. Magma surged through the huge wound, the seas boiled, land masses cracked. Finally, the world disintegrated. Since then, despite hopelessly optimistic rumors of the vessel's destruction, Abaddon has unleashed the Planet Killer at the head of his most destructive fleets. The Planet Killer bears no resemblance to any human vessel, and some Magi technologists believe it could not have been constructed in real space. Inquisitor Horst claimed the Halo worlds of Lanamorgstein as a source for data used in the ship's construction, and Abaddon's seizure of Tricali crystal deposits led to conjunctures of warp containment technology. Still, no sanctified hypothesis has withstood scrutiny as to how the warship generates the amount of power it does. The destruction of an entire world is an act Abaddon only commits when it gains him a distinct advantage. The explicit threat alone is a valuable tool. Beyond that, the Planet Killer is a behemoth of destruction in both planetary assaults and open void warfare. Its launch cradles can disgorge swarms of dropships, atmospheric fighters and bomber flights, enough to conquer worlds by themselves. The ship possesses the firepower to wipe out patrol fleets single-handedly. With macro-weapon batteries, lance turrets of incandescent power, and massed torpedo salvos, the vessel outguns any warship in the Imperial Armada. Its armor and void shields can shrug off even direct hits, while enemy borders are met not only by elite Black Legionaries, but also empiric entities bound into the ship that gleefully shred their souls. Sanguiterra's capital region stretches over 50 miles in breadth, in an extensive and haphazard spread of crowded urban hapstacks, pollution-wreathed industrial spires, and crumbling palatial edifices. Before the sanguis flare engulfed the planet, it had been largely still. Immense tracts of the urban sprawl's outer districts and all of the mass transitways and bore rail lines that once linked it to other city sprawls had been swallowed in a toxic wasteland polluted by mutated horrors and demons. Though the region is now isolated, much of urban sprawl Alpha's principal infrastructure survived the flare. At the heart of the sprawl's Primus district stands the Prefectus Bastion complex. Protected by the complex's thick curtain wall, bastion, sub-bastions, gun emplacements, and shield generators is the greatest concentration of political, strategic, and religious power on Sanguiterra. The Didactus Palace, the Officio Militarum Fortress, and the Cathedrum of the Pyre Deified constitute a hub of command and control for the whole planet and maintain thrice-blessed strategic links to other stations across Sanguiterra. The Bastion was an obvious target, and Imperial Command believed that Haarken Worldclaimer would strike there at the first opportunity. Much of the capital defense forces had been stationed at the Prefectus Bastion. When Junith Eruita arrived, she dispatched some to reinforce other sites within Urban Sprawl Alpha, seeing in each a strategically vital location, be it in direct defense terms to maintain supply and communication lines, or respecting the world's wider spiritual fortitude. The Tower of Murmuration, home to the region's astropaths, the Akranador spaceport, and the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery of orbital cannons were amongst the most important. Transit between the Sprawl's districts was slow, and the forces defending each area could not expect swift reinforcement. The invasion begins. Captain Shazon gripped the arm of his command throne with one hand, his knuckles whitening. Irritable mutters from his bridge crew, the clicking of servitors processing data psalms, the stink from his uniform worn for too many shifts. They wore away at composure, already thinned by inaction. The wait was torment. Shazon had kept station with the light cruiser, Lord Chorobes, and its patrol fleet, Hydra 4, near the Sanguis Mandeville Point for several ships' months. They were one of scores of such patrols, awaiting the heretics that every doom-laden augury insisted would emerge from the Nachmund Gauntlet. What made the wait worse were the tales of near massacres. Loyal ships had emerged from the warp recently, their crews too slow or too few to transmit clearance ciphers immediately. Tragedies had only narrowly been averted. Shazon was contemplating another stim injection when a chime stabbed through his thoughts. It was the ship's navigator, he saw, reporting that something was about to emerge from the warp. "Signal the rest of Hydra 4, Shazon snapped to his Voxmaster. He ran a hand over his red eyes and through his greasy hair as his mind woke to the demands of action. Around the bridge, everyone, save the lobotomized servitors, stirred into an alert bustle. "Master Grizz, who is it?" he demanded. Shazon waited for the Master of Augury to ratify the incoming ship's identity, eyeing the screens behind the bridge's vaulted ceiling. Vectors looped across the screen starfields in bright whirls, as a master of astrometry and her cogitator cores attempted to pass the navigator's mystical probabilities into tactical likelihoods. "There is a substantial number, Captain," Grizz reported from his overseer position at Augury. "Focusing on translation site, aperture remains broad, consistent with multiple vessels," came the voice of the master of astrometry. On the screens, a portion of the void at the edge of the Sanguis system became marked with a series of numerical runes. "I have 7 signals so far," Grizz said. "Authorization hymnals bear genuine clearance ciphers. They are within the tolerances set by Sector Command, but—" Grizz paused infuriatingly. Jason held his temper, determined not to act in haste. On the screens the vectors tightened. The light of distant stars twisted, reality distorting with the imminent translation. "The authorizations are a strange mix. Battlefleet Gorendal and Battlefleet Nachmund encryptions, Cypramundi Chartist endorsements, but far from their usual routes. Plus dispensation for salvaged freighters under the Articles of Redemption." A blind pinprick lit the screen, then 3 more, then a dozen others. The vid-screen's machine spirits hid the sight of empiric energy bleeding from the wound in reality, but Shazon could see the sickly unlight reflected from the emerging vessels. They were all horrifically damaged. Red sigils ringed them on the displays, as Lord Chorabes identified critical systems threatening the ship's life support. Most limped away from the translation site, but some failed to ignite their real space engines and drifted. It was incredible that they had managed to make the translation intact. Grizz's voice droned on, identifying one ship after another, while the captain marshalled Hydra 4 to effect a swift salvation mission. Some of those arriving were warships of Shazon's own battle fleet. The survivors merited his help. The Lord Chorabes led the approach. When Grizz shouted a warning, Shazon realized the Master of Vox had not spoken for several moments. The captain turned from his organization of Hydra 4, dread churning his stomach as he lifted his eyes to the screens. Dozens of new sigils were suddenly there, more appearing every second. Huge and angular, ancient warships burst from the warp, as if from the pages of some historical tract of Shazon's academia days. They barged through the group of damaged vessels, and his mind went numb as he saw several were already in optimal firing range. The damaged ship ceased transmitting. All of them. No longer needed. Decoys. Shazon saw in that moment that this was no horrible coincidence. "Alert the nearest patrols! Contact Sanguiterra!" Grizz shouted, the voice a distant burr. "For Throne's sake, Captain! Bring us about! Bring us about!" The Lord Chorabes died first. The rest of its patrol fought bravely, but they were out of position, and the void skirmish was over in minutes. The carcasses of Hydra 4 drifted. Belches of atmosphere, unfired munition, and unused plasma flared from the wrecks. The herald of the apocalypse had arrived. Death in the void. The arrival of Haarken Worldclaimer's fleet in the Sanguis system spelt death for the crews of many of the patrol fleets the Sanguinterran War Council had deployed. Along with strings of deep void surveyor stations, they had been the system's first line of defense against the invaders. Whatever advantage Sanguiterra's commanders had hoped to gain from these defenses was undermined by Haarken's strategy. The naval officers of the Sanguiterran War Council had initially spread what warships remained in the system thinly, hoping to plug any hole by which Haarken's fleet might slip through unnoticed. The prevailing military theory was that the greater the speed at which any traitor invasion fleet's location and strength could be determined, the better armed the strategos and commanders on Sanguiterra would be to respond. Only when Junith Eruita arrived did things belatedly change. The Canoness Superior made the time to listen to advice from commanders newly deployed to the world, as well as others whom the poorly resourced War Council had failed to adequately heed thus far, the most prominent of which was Rear Admiral Borkil, a veteran strategist who had escaped the destruction of the command bastion on Nonavor. Backed by Borkil, Eruita's proposal saw the largest void ships and many smaller squadrons pulled back from their system-wide deployments. Her strategy was to place them far from the Mandeville point, but capable of reacting in force in any direction by the quickest possible route. The remaining smaller and swifter vessels were reorganized into patrol flotillas, and their experienced captains were given orders to scour the outer systems for signs of the traitors. While some of these stalked through the interplanetary void, most were concentrated in the region of the system's Mandeville point to scrutinize incoming void traffic and guard against the arrival of enemy ships. It was hoped that what these patrols lacked in broad dispersal was made up for by their constant mobility and resilience in numbers that would allow them to report any discovery they made before being overwhelmed. These swift patrols had to contend with the frequent arrival of ragged refugee ships, surviving warships limping in from within the Nachmund Gauntlet, and a daily influx of new armies borne by troop barges and mass conveyors. Expecting an enemy invasion fleet any day, the patrol crews were stretched to breaking point. The pleasure bark Marquis de Arantine was mistakenly fired upon, its ciphers poorly handled by the inexperienced Vox officer. Nearly 500 soldiers were swept from the breached hull before emergency integrity shields could be raised. Though insignificant when placed beside the looming threat of Haarken Worldclaimer, this tragedy and others like it wore away at the wearied crews of the patrols. When Haarken's fleet finally arrived, his agents in the Sanguis system had already laid out the situation to him. He did not fail to exploit it. The Traitors Lie. Haarken's armada had crushed many Imperial fleets in its aggressive surge through the Nachmund Gauntlet. His eyes had been on Abaddon's prize at the other end, so not every Imperial ship had been blasted apart. Some had been boarded and taken as prizes. Those whose internal systems had not been severely damaged in the taking had been incorporated into his fleet. Their original crews replaced with gangs of helot serfs, cadres of out-of-favour legionaries, or skeleton teams of servitor clades, coordinated by magi of the Dark Mechanicum. These stolen ships were placed at the forefront of Worldclaimer's armada when the final warp translation to the Sanguis system was made. Some never reached it, their weakened bulkheads collapsing under the warp's tides, or their damaged Geller field generators fragile enough to allow predator entities to slip through and slay all aboard. Those that did make it broadcasted authentications that had been painfully dragged from their captains' lips or torn from their minds. The Worldclaimer's armada pierced the veil of the warp in more than a dozen locations at the Sanguis system's Mandeville point. The stolen Imperial ships were sent through first as decoys. The combination of their damaged state, inefficient crews, and genuine clearance ciphers distracted and wrong-footed the patrol flotillas that confronted them, some of which moved in to provide aid while others hesitated for fatal minutes as they authenticated the varied ship's origins. Haarken had known his ruse would last only moments, but that was all his warships that pushed into the system behind the stolen vessels had needed. At all but 2 translation sites, his battleships, cruisers, and their escorts powered through the now redundant stolen ships and obliterated the Imperial flotillas as they moved to conduct inspections of the supposedly loyal crews. Urlix II Patrol detected a fleet of Haarken's ships before the traitors were in optimal firing range. They came about and tried to race for Sanguiterra, while their astropaths screamed a warning. However, their maneuver had cost them flat-out speed, and each was picked apart by the long-range weapons of Haarken's grand cruisers. The captains of Bastion 11 Patrol scattered, the flotilla's vessels each diving on a separate heading. The tactic allowed half of them to escape or hide, making rapid course alterations and transmitting low-strength Vox signals before cutting reactor power to evade detection. Flight into darkness. Though he had passed the system's edge, Haarken's armada was still days away from Sanguiterra. Even with their plasma engines pushing them across interplanetary space, the distance between the Mandeville point to intercept the world's orbit was immense. The final long-range communiques from the patrols of Urlix II and Bostar 11 had been received at the Prefectus Bastion. Their warnings arrived in scraps, only partially decipherable due to the haste with which they had been sent. Precious hours were spent sifting the substance of them and broadcasting fruitless requests for confirmation codes before one of the surveyor stations belatedly confirmed the crisis. Eruita had used her authority to place Admiral Borkil at the head of the naval delegation. Once the enemy's presence was known, he worked swiftly to make their remaining fleet strength count. His aides assessed and mapped the vectors of Haarken's fleets, assigning each an identifying numeral. From the scant data available, Borkil's keen mind picked out one of the traitor fleets, which lagged behind the others, coded Heretic Fleet Group Lambdau. Whether it had endured a damaging translation or was sorely wounded by the patrols did not matter to Borkil. He dispatched over half of the system's warships at the traitor fleet. To divide the Imperial ships between several heretic fleet groups would have been an unforgivable waste of the Emperor's weapons and servants, while to hold them back at Sangue Terra as a wall of armoured prows and readied gun decks would have handed Haarken's massed fleet countless megatons of ships ready to fall in cataclysmic bombardment to the planet below. Unsupported, Heretic Fleet Lambdau at least could be bled. The capital ships and escorts of Battlefleet Gorandal that remained in the Sangue system joined with squadrons of Pugnacia system monitors, explosives-packed fireships, and as many Adeptus Astartes vessels as were gifted to the newly formed flotilla. Powerful ships belonging to the rogue trader Cripian Telanaurosia and the Frateres Templar sworn battleship of Eruita, God Emperor's Mantle, were also amongst them. Led by Captain Fulvian of the Sons of Medusa, the ad hoc fleet made all speed towards where Heretic Fleet Group Lambdau had translated from the warp far above the ecliptic, in the region almost directly above Sangue Terra's northern pole. The Fulvian's fleet closed most of the distance, posing a threat that forced Lambdau's ships to slow and maneuver to meet them or risk leaving themselves vulnerable. By ship's reckoning, the void battle that followed lasted 4 hours. Fulvian held his ship, the strike cruiser Judgment of Megira, back as long as he dared, instead orchestrating the attack angles and sometimes individual firing solutions of his mixed force with precision. From the moment the two fleets' vanguard lines gained range on each other, lance turrets, plasma batteries, and torpedo salvos flashed between them. In the first hours, Fulvian's tactic of targeting the traitors' swifter escorts resulted in dozens of wrecked destroyers, frigates, and gunboats, as he hoped to maintain a maneuverability advantage. His wedge-like formation of ships rotated as it closed the gap between peeling apart into 3 distinct arcing lines of vessels. The heavier capital ships at regular intervals like the cog teeth of splintered mechanisms, their flanks guarded by escort vessels. Haarken's experienced captains drew their ships together into mutually supportive fields of fire to break the cohesion of Fulvian ships and disrupt their coordinated broadsides. The initial destruction of their escorts had buckled the traitors' lines, but their greater number of capital ships and their monstrous firepower began to tell. The battle took a more complex and far more brutal turn, as ships closed within operational distance of swarms of void-capable fighters and bombers. Fulvian's heavier Space Marine and Imperial Navy vessels closed to within boarding distance. Teleportation strikes, boarding torpedoes, and squadrons of heavy assault landers struck both sides. The traitors initially took the worst damage, as their crippled vessels became a danger to the others in their close formation. By then, the augurs of Judgment of Megira had detected an additional 57 heretic warships closing on his position from Haarken's other mostly undamaged fleets. Captain Fulvian acknowledged that they could fight on, destroy a few more ships, but they would be annihilated in return. Such inefficient equations were not to be borne. He ordered what was left of Sangue Terra's attack fleet to retreat. More Imperial ships were lost in the extrication, but at least a third of their original number struck out for the system's edge in escape. Chor Khan. When the demon lord Chor Khan claimed Sanguiterra's moon of Sigil in the wake of the Sangua's flare. Its cackling shriek of exultant triumph haunted the dreams of sleeping psychers half a segmentum away. A sizable fortified enclave of Sanguiterra, before the incursion of Chorkan's legions, the demon's malign influence had turned Sigil into a maddening fortress of mutated crystal and living flesh. So corrupted, the boundary between real space and the warp had been weakened even further at Sigil, allowing ever more demons to pour through, threatening the entire system. In time, according to the demon's labyrinthine plans for the Sanguis system, Sigil would become a barb of the creature's power so profoundly embedded in real space that nothing short of cataclysm could remove its influence. Chorkan's soul fires burned at the planetoid's core, its polar citadel blazing with empiric distortion, etching a circlet of change round Sanguis that threaded its influence into it. With a portion of its essence hooked into real space, every orbit stitched a reinforcing loop into its grip. Chorkan was sure the mortal servants of the Dark Gods would stoop to any duplicitous bargain to access the gateway it alone controlled. Precision deployment. The capacity of Chaos Space Marines to deploy for planetary assault has lost none of its horror, speed and power in the 10,000 years since it was first unleashed upon the Emperor's worlds. If anything, it has become more honed, sharpened like their bitterness. In the aftermath of the warp flare, the mutated landscapes left across much of Sanguiterra were nightmarish wastes that could threaten even Haarken's veteran warriors and war engines. They seethed with boiling lakes of demonic ichor and ribbons of incandescent empiric fire. Empathic toxins, hemorrhage-inducing vapors, and meadows of fleshy cilia, capable of rendering plasteel down to iridescent slurry, sprayed in profusion, while predatory beasts, possibly once native life forms, hunted for living flesh. Haarken needed nothing from such expanses. Their extent, however, meant they surrounded many of his targets. Dense sprawls, industrial belts, and isolated bastions dotted the surface between the wastes. Even the least of these surviving islands of civilization and infrastructure was thus rendered a vital strategic prize. To move between or invade them, armies would be forced to move primarily by air, or strike from orbit with sudden fury. Sanguiterra enchained. Save the delayed and decimated fleet known to the War Council as Landau, and the heretic ships Haarken had spared to save them, the rest of the Worldclaimer's armada had not slowed their advance to Sanguiterra. The malice and power they possessed were enough to raise the world twice over. Haarken's fleet converged on Sanguiterra and closed in from all sides in the days following the Void battle. Augur satellites were swatted from their path by ships' close-range cannons. Weapons arrays in high equatorial orbit began firing at the invaders as soon as they were within range. The guns of some fell swiftly silent, however, as their crews fought claustrophobic battles with traitors and cultists risen from within their own ranks. Orbital Sigma Z524 fired on its closest neighbor, its gunners hoping an act of betrayal might spare them. Each array was obliterated, and their debris burned a sooty ring around the world's upper atmosphere. Half of the Worldclaimer's armada settled into geostationary orbits over dozens of targets across Sanguiterra's surface. The rest split into subfleets, spreading into picket positions in higher orbits. Haarken lumbered Planet Killer into position after all others were in place. The gargantuan ship maneuvered into an anchorage of graphitic equilibrium between the planet and its moon, Sigil. The pact with Sigil. Before giving the order to commence the invasion of Sanguiterra, Haarken had a final piece to position in his strategy. He employed a cabal of sorcerers to reach out from the Planet Killer to contact the moon's demon lord, Chorkan. The creature's warp-spawned servants were already on the surface of Sanguiterra, hunting and defiling armies that attempted to brave the planet's corrupted waste and make inroads into as-yet uncorrupted areas. Haarken meant to ally them to the War Master's will and have them fight in support of the conquest. The Worldclaimer knew enough about demons to consider them, at the very least, an unknown quantity. At worst, the capricious entities could turn their monstrous power against him. They would not ever dare strike against the War Master, he believed, but despite this conquest being wrought in Abaddon's name, the fact remained that he was not here. Chor-Khan had manifested aboard Haarken's flagship, and with the pentagrammatic lattice of a silver-etched entropic cage safeguarding each from the other, the pact was sealed in blood and sacrifice. The Worldclaimer bought the services of the creature, the vivid demon pledging its unnatural minions in support of Abaddon's desires, and granting the boon of a twisted sigil to be borne by some of Haarken's champions. It was to mark the compact that had been struck, gifting those who carried it greater power than they had known before. The price for these gifts was high, but Haarken was prepared to pay it. Planet Strike. Haarken Worldclaimer instigated the conquest of Sanguiterra the moment the demon's presence had left Planet Killer. His ships commenced ferocious but tightly focused bombardments, aiming to flatten locations harboring concentrations of the defenders, while avoiding targets that had to remain relatively intact. As soon as the last volley had been fired, his hosts poured down onto the world in a torrent. The capital of Urbaner Sprawl Alpha was Haarken's principal target. Still, many other hives, Factorum Sprawls, Bastions, and Voxspires across the face of Sanguiterra had been selected as initial objectives to be secured before his main blow fell. The silicate processing macro plants at Greffendeep fell to Emperor's children of the vibrant choristry. Strike squadrons of the Shadowflight toppled the supposedly impregnable grey pinnacle at the Drexus landing fields. The Runic Blazon and Crowfeast of Xenarec warbands engulfed the soldiers at the Taethok barracks beneath sorcerous darkness in which the traitors butchered the defenders over 3 long days. Haarken granted many of his most influential lords the sigil offered by Chor-Khan. The powerful warriors and sorcery wielders carried the arcane marking, a shining filigree upon helmets, gouged it roughly into breastplates or daubed it onto banners, cloaks or skin flaps strung between trophy racks. Some among Haarken's senior warlords cast scorn on the gift, for the Worldclaimer had bestowed it only on those who had been divisive and capricious generals during the long march through the Nachmund Gauntlet. Prominent war leaders all, who had already claimed huge tallies of blood-soaked glory for themselves. The most voluble of dissenters, amongst them Zerhan Nethar of the Night Lords, claimed it was weakness on Haarken's part, an obvious attempt to buy his authority over those who threatened it. However, the Herald of the Apocalypse soon showed that he expected the warlords to prove themselves worthy of the demonic sigil, with those bearing Chor-Khan's mark ordered to attack some of the most heavily defended targets. Among these were the Scopulix Observatoriums, whose fortified temples were strung along the equatorial mountain peaks, the Aeronautica Plateau spread across the southern storm basins, and the twin deep-core refineries of Vorganza Jahel at the northern pole. Scarovectus, demon prince of the Death Guard, was one such warlord. He used the rotting fever corpses of a hidden cult to Grandfather Nurgle to open up a fissure at Urbaner Sprawl Pyroxes. He and his plague marines emerged as intended, but the cult, striving to remain unnoticed from rigorous purges in recent weeks, had fled deep into the bowels of a hab complex. The contagion they carried struck them down while hidden, rather than during their congregation in Pyroxes' Plaza Principalis, as instructed. Scarovectus' force took almost a day to force a path through the subterranean districts, his fetid warrior's presence soon detected by the defending Imperial Guardsmen and Space Marines. With the element of surprise lost, the Demon Prince's force became embroiled in a grinding slog through massed Imperial firepower. The city's defenders established a series of choke points through which they fell back in good order, denying Scarovectus the opportunity to tear them apart. Other forces of Haarken's, disproportionately those carrying the demonic sigil of Chor-Khan, suffered similar misfortunes. The warband known as the Whispering Shadow failed to receive fire support from the Iron Warriors of the Anathraxis war host after the gunships carrying Perturabo's sons were shot down. The Black Legionaries of the Crimson Claw were pinned at Ascalion's summit between an immovable force of dug-in Ultramarines and a flanking column of Tempestus Scions that struck the traitors from low-flying Valkyrie gunships. The Headman Strike. Despite the deaths and delays suffered by the armies led by Haarken's sigil-marked champions, most achieved ruinous success. Multiple beachheads were secured, while Imperial supply and communication lines were severed from the Shangaro uplands from the fair Nural Peninsula. Imperial responses were swift, with rapid deployments of armies from as yet untouched Urbano sprawls supporting those attacked. The Worldclaimer monitored these movements closely, drawing information to Planet Killer from the rest of the Armada surrounding Sanguiterra. Crossing the hazardous waste to launch their counterattacks rendered efforts to aid even nearby cities or fortifications risky. More than one mobilized reserve fell foul of the warp-saturated landscape itself, while others were set upon by the demonic legions of Chorkan as the Demon Lord upheld its side of the pact. Several Imperial armies departed Urbano Sprawl Alpha aboard swift flights of gunships and lumbering heavy armored landers, the capital region having amassed huge reserves of defenders for this purpose. Each army that left, however, opened another chink in the capital's armor. With Urbano Sprawl Alpha weakened, Haarken ordered the assault on the capital region. His single word of command was broadcast from Planet Killer to reach not only the ships of those who would join him, but also to blare out from sabotaged emitter shrines and vox chapels across the capital region so that his prey may spend their last hours in terror and unrest. The Worldclaimer led his gloom talons in one of several precision strikes, indicating the importance he placed on the targets there. Nethtar's Fear Rakers and Commodore's Dread Lance of Chaos Knights also deployed to Urbano Sprawl Alpha. Haarken's gloom talons would hit the Akrandor spaceport before moving to the Prefectus Bastion complex. The Fear Rakers would silence the Tower of Murmuration and House Mandracore the guns of the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery, before both would move to support Haarken's push for the Central Pass. The Alpha Storm. The Imperial commanders at Urbano Sprawl Alpha had spent the days since the invasion began in a hurricane of intense coordination. When the Worldclaimer's host struck at the planet, they only bent their wills to it more. While they attempted to deflect or repulse invasions across Sanguiterra, they girded themselves for the strike they knew would come against their command headquarters. Haarken's strike against Urbano Sprawl Alpha was presaged by mass uprisings of Chaos Cots and insurrectionist cells throughout the beleaguered cityscape. Traitors enthralled to the dark gods of chaos had been seeded and supplied by Haarken's agents hailing from his vanguard fleets. What had begun as acts of sabotage and assassination bloomed to engulf whole habit districts in violent riots and mass ritual murders. The Hasfura docklands that gave access to the Shrikal Sea had blazed for 3 days, as 7 regiments hailing from Cadia, Savlar, and Iros pummeled turncoat cultists among the Stevedore clans. The Prefectus Bastion's mass complex and emplacement-strewn grounds remained unbreached despite attempts by kill teams of Chaos Space Marines who had somehow reached the capital region undetected. Through Haarken's bombardment and the first assaults to hit the capital region, Junith Eruita had not left the precincts of the Officio Militarum fortress. From there, in the Prefectus Bastion's heart, she and the War Council strove to organize the defense of other Urbano Sprawls. While Eruita strategized, her 5th Preceptory of Battle Sisters from the Order of our Martyred Lady under Canoness Precept Viridine's leadership had kept the complex sacrosanct. They patrolled the battlements of the Didactos Palace and the Cathedral of the Pyre Deified. They stood sentinel through the halls of Eruita's Strategium and the rest of the Officio Militarum fortress. Viridine had established numerous missions of the 5th Preceptory to act as hunting patrols along the complex's shield walls, leading one herself and it was they who had caught and destroyed the infiltrating heretics before they could breach the defences. To the northeast of the Prefectus Bastion, near where a long tongue of burning land, the Flare Scar, cut through several districts, Eruita had placed a fortis maniple of titans from the Legio Tempestor. Princeps Drentor and his engines stood ready near the Sprawl's centre to respond to the most significant threats at the War Council's command. Eruita had redeployed many of the armies from Urbana Sprawl Alpha to other regions for counterattacks or salvation missions. She understood how this lessened her options in the face of Haarken's expected assault, but to do nothing as other Sprawls fought and died would only cede the planet to Worldclaimer and leave Urbana Sprawl Alpha surrounded without any allies left. The capital region was far from undefended. In addition to the titans of Princeps Drentor, Demi-Company Vol, a strike force of the Guardians of the Covenant, and led by Master Nardreth, had taken position defending the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery. Indeed, they already fought to hold the mighty guns, for another precursor attack had flowed in from the haunted wastes, this one a headlong charge by hideous demonic hordes. Inquisitor Cartavlonus had declared to the War Council that he would secure the Tower of Murmuration. By the time the heretic assault hit, his large force had already established fortified trench lines and weapons emplacements throughout much of the surrounding Viridian district. His black iconoclast formed his greatest strength. Imperial guardsmen reinforced them from dozens of different regiments the Inquisitor had pressed into his service. Cartavlonus himself spent almost his entire time on the planet within the Tower of Murmuration, directing the astropaths within to dispatch encrypted messages with vermilion clearance ciphers to many other Inquisitors. Unbeknownst to those he fought alongside, Cartavlonus had come to the difficult conclusion that the Nachmund Gauntlet could not be allowed to remain open lest it drown the Imperium Sanctus in traitor filth. Covertly, he sought the means and support to attempt this colossal undertaking, even as his fellow commanders laboured to firm up their defensive lines and prepare for the Worldclaimer's onslaught. Haarken's forces slammed down upon the capital region in unison. Baron Commodore and the Knights of House Mandracore made planetfall in the far east of the Vectorum district amidst mars of hab blocks that had been reduced to blackened ruin by Haarken's bombardment. Commodore had been tasked with destroying the huge guns of the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery, but had been forced to deploy at a distance due to the dense urban architecture that still stood around his target. The landing barges of his knights needed a great deal of space to disgorge their cargo. They touched down amidst howling flames before the Knights of House Mandracore strode out. Unnatural darkness curdled into storm clouds above them as Baron Commodore led their marching advance into the Munitorum district. He hoped to trap the Guardians of the Covenant, attacking from their rear as Chorkan's demon legions tore at their front ranks. Midnight Dread. Zehar Nethtar's prized dread missiles are vile creations. They are crafted by his Night Lord's warpsmiths, mixing forbidden dark technology, eldritch Xenos lore, and the expertise in torture present amongst the Fear-Rakers. Each dread missile represents a considerable expense of time and resources. Only Nethtar's flagship, the modified slaughter-class cruiser, Hollow, holds his limited store. Several shrieking coils are at the core of these weapons, each an annulus of biological matter stitched together from the brain stems of captured psychers. These individuals are subjected to untold empiric torment, while chirurgic servitors peel their bodies apart in agonizing surgeries lasting days. The living cerebral tissues are linked to those of other victims, and neurological pulses flicker in cycles between them. The specific fears of one individual are shared and magnified, until the trembling ring of grey tissue radiates waves of palpable terror. Dozens of shrieking coils are fitted into each dread missile. They are steeped in a brine of engineered hormones, arid viral scrap code, and threaded with a core of ashy material left after warp translations. Surrounded with explosives, these payloads are finally built into the shell of a void torpedo and sealed in stasis vaults to retain their piquancy. Shadowfall. Zehar Nethtar, the Chain Flyer, deployed from an aerial swarm of his fleet's gunships towards the Viridian District and the Tower of Murmuration. Before his host of raptors and warp talons reached the surface, his arrival was heralded by one of his precious store of dread missiles, fired from his flagship to detonate ahead of him. A seething mass of psychoclastic shadow billowed up from the explosion. It hid Nethtar's final descent as he led his hunting brothers from his gunship holds to arrow through the clouds of terror. The detonation of the dread missile occurred half a mile above the surface, directly over the capital Sprawl's Viridian District. The transmuted empiric ash of its hyper-dense core spread against the prevailing wind in black bubbles of shadow. Tormented howls and wordless shrieks surged with cyclonic force as concentrated terror fell in pyroplastic droplets of oily fluid. Hundreds of Imperial guardsmen abandoned their posts, mad with soul-deep fear. Others suffered cranial hemorrhages or struck catatonic, crumpling to the ground with glassy eyes and slack mouths trailing foul black bile. Cotavalonis had spent little time organizing his defenses around the border grounds of the Tower of Murmuration, so fixated had he been on accessing its astropathic masters and directing them to dispatch his messages. Despite the efforts of his elite black iconoclasts, gaping holes yawned in the lines of the Inquisitor's force through death, desertion, and insanity, as a pyroclastic shadow engulfed them. Night Lords' dropships landed under cover of the Eldritch Shadow, and warbands of midnight-clad infantry stalked from them, carving through one Imperial trench line, firepoint and gun emplacement after another. Murderous flocks of raptors, led by the Chain Flare, powered from the storm-racked miasma as it crowded out the light. Their jump assaults gouged the heart from the remaining knots of cohesive defense by the black iconoclasts. Traitor gunships chewed through ranks of rallying soldiery and makeshift barricades, enabling Nethtar's mass landers to reach the surface unmolested and disgorge the first of his heavy armor squadrons. Inquisitor Cotavalonis narrowly avoided death when the dread missile detonated. Thousands of avian servitors that roosted in the eaves of the Tower of Murmuration took flight at once. The cyber swarm shapes formed by the flock, once of ritual significance to aid the tower's masters, were now of leering death's heads and reaching talons. Yet even their animalistic shrieks of maddening dismay were drowned out by the astropath's shrieks. The bow wave of psychic terror tore through their minds, and black lightning poured from their mouths as they screamed. The energy output shattered the tower's pinnacle. Cotavalonis, badly scarred, heaved himself from the steps at its base as the rest began to collapse. Facing what was rapidly becoming an unrecoverable strategic collapse, the remnants of the black iconoclast abandoned the worst afflicted companies of Imperial guardsmen to the Night Lords. A few platoons of veteran soldiers stumbled in their wake, ingrained survival instincts overriding their conscious terror. The black iconoclasts and what was left of the Inquisitor soldiers converged in good order around the Tower of Murmuration and their wounded master, before beginning a fighting retreat towards the safety promised by the Prefectus Bastion. The dread missile had overpowered local Vox networks with scream-filled cyberstatic. Cotavalonis, therefore, had no inkling that the Herald of the Apocalypse already marched towards him. The Worldclaimer's assault on the Akrandor spaceport had been mercilessly swift. Squadrons of interceptors and fighter bombers launched by the Planet Killer had obliterated the spaceport's aerial defense. Black Legion gunships delivered Haarken and his most favored raptors into the spaceport's command spires. Dropships delivered squads of heavily armored infantry, and Chaos Terminator veterans appeared in blazes of teleportation flare, killing before the blinding flashes had faded. All Imperial resistance either bloodily collapsed or was routed. Haarken paused only long enough to drive his Hellspear into the corpse of the spaceport's comptroller and claim Sanguiterra. His next target was the Prefectus Bastion. Voices filled the humid air of the Strategium with a dense and many-layered cacophony. They swam around Junith Eruita like biting insects. Blustering stutters from red-faced marshals, emotionless reports from servitors, aghast timbers from civilian members of the War Council, the strident tones of Sisters Dialogus, shouts, gasps, groans, and demands. Always demands, Junith thought. Demands for information, for confirmation, for acquiescence, for any response at all. Junith's gaze flickered between crystal screens. Around her, officers and adepts attended to their tasks. The screen's glow made their faces appear as graven from granite. She silently recited a prayer of sagacious calm to keep a rein of her fury as she read one litany of unholy treachery after another. She tightened her grip on the mace of castigation, where it stood head down on the plasteel floor of the strategium. Junith finished reading the last grim inload. The traitors had finally struck Urbana Sprawl Alpha. Everyone in the chamber, of course, had felt the bombardment, even though no ordnance had come close to hitting the Perfectus Bastion. Whatever dark witchery had been unleashed on the Viridian district, however, had already begun to spread towards her position. The heretics are at our door, Junith thought. She allowed the buzz of orders to break through her thoughts. They spoke of nothing but the assault on the capital region. But I cannot abandon the faith of a world for one district. Without looking, Junith began making demands of her nearest aides, asking for Vox channels to be opened to dozens of commanders around the planet. She stabbed an armored fingertip at runic sigils on the screen before her and raised her voice over the din, seeking tactical input, assessing strategic strength, and gauging mobility. Those around her, regimental and naval officers, tech priests, logisticians, and strategos, and spring-heeled factotums, moved to action her requests. All the while, Junith continued to mentally recite canticles of serenity and focus. Her efforts became less effective as the war drew nearer and battle wrath threatened to infuse her. She could not give in to zeal until her strategy was in motion and pulled on her discipline to cool her passions. She sensed unease around her, a pause here, a stifled query there. They wanted to know what would happen to this sprawl, to them. Those of her order within the strategium and those of her sister's other orders understood that to fight and die in the God Emperor's wars was righteous service made manifest, and all that should concern any loyal citizen. In her fiery youth, Junith had despised anyone who even thought otherwise. An unsullied anger still blazed in her soul, ready to rise to the fore when needed in battle. But she had risen to command in the largest order militant in the Imperium. With that came the understanding that, where she and her sisters needed only faith, other God Emperor servants needed something concrete to hang their hopes. Junith finalized the last order that the God Emperor had seen fit to give her the time for. She would depart in minutes, taking her warriors out to meet the foe face to face, to protect this complex and the wealth of data stacks, cartographs, and Vox encryption equipment it contained. Before that, those who remained needed to know. She lifted her gaze, taking in the crowded figures around her. Conversations faltered, until all she could hear was a thrum of atmospheric cyclers as they circulated the smells of sweat and sacred incense. Doubt is a presence which true faith drives out. You and I have a duty to the God Emperor to save one of his worlds. There will be death for some, for many, but it is a holy honor to perish having slain the Xenos and the Mutant, the Witch, the Heretic. I go now to face those who would defile this sacred place, to safeguard their souls so that you can safeguard others. I go to fight the battle. See that you all continue the war. A war of angels. The heavens afire. Junith Eruita's 5th Preceptory had buckled under the assault of Haarken's gloom talons, but not broken. The Perfectus Bastion's towering edifices remained untouched by the Worldclaimer's hosts, but the Canoness Superior knew that their purity would not remain undefiled without support. Haarken's highly mobile warriors plunged into the Battle Sisters' lines to the north of the Perfectus Bastion in repeated stabs. Spearheads of raptors thrust down into Eruita's forces, using their jump packs to leap back before the survivors could rally and cut them off. These gouging raids occurred across the breadth of Eruita's deployment, each carefully coordinated by the Worldclaimer for maximum cruelty and bloodshed. In the wake of the exfiltrating raptor spearheads, Helldrakes, Predator squadrons, and legionaries mounted in speeding Chaos Rhinos advanced, punishing any attempt by the Battle Sisters to give chase. Only around Eruita herself did Haarken's airborne spearheads fail to reap the tally of souls they had elsewhere. Beneath her feet, the heavy flamers of the pulpit of St. Hollin's Basilica scoured heretics in blazing pyres of melted armour. Between rapid advances or feigning manoeuvres by Eruita's Dominion squads and counterattacks by heavy flamer-wielding retributors, a roaring conflagration surrounded the Canoness Superior's position. The flames reached so high that they were visible from the Hasfur docklands, appearing to set fire to the sky. Though it had marginally thinned, the cloud of terror unleashed on the Viridian district was spreading. The leading edges of the dense haze had reached the southern cloisters of the Didactos Palace and the Cathedral of the Pyre Deified. Flashes of cursed lightning crackled through its interior, and clusters of orange tongues of flame like fireflies showed the movement within its mass of Nethtar's fear-rakers. Eruita redeployed many flamer-equipped squads of her order from the Bastion's complex northern fortifications, commanding them to reinforce her front lines. With their added fire, the towering banks of flames and incense-saturated pillars of smoke spread further and rose higher. The flame-licked thermals met the pyroclastic mass as it expanded, impossibly against the wind, to engulf the cathedral. The cold light of the cloud's occasional illumination and the fiery smoke met in a thunderhead, each piling higher, as if seeking to overcome and swallow the other. It was in the interstice between the two that a saviour manifested. The hero martyrs return. A golden sphere of light burst above the cathedral of the Pyre Deified, within the firestorm and storm-lit clouds. More illumination flared from the same point again and again, each larger than the last, and haloing those they succeeded. Shafts of jeweled energy like gilded spears thrust through the swelling sphere, piercing the dark masses to either side. With a final concussive blast, accompanied by a deafening chime of holy clarity, the sphere swelled to enormous size. The pyroclastic mass over the cathedral shrank and fractured. Dark specks within the cloud, advanced squads of Nethtar's Night Lords, who'd almost reached the complex's heart, were flung south through the air, tumbling in the ethereal tempest. The flames and smoke rising from the Order of Our Martyred Lady's 5th Preceptory battle lines bent beneath the outpouring of energy. Forced lower and away from the Bastion complex, the flames roared into Haarken's gloom talons. Fed by whatever sacred power drove them, the flame and red-hot ash sheets consumed the traitor warriors and battle tanks nearest Eruita's lines. Above the cathedral, the glowing sphere of light dimmed. Streamers of its shed energy radiated outwards, staining the sky gold and mantling the battlements in a shimmering corpuscent. Silhouetted against the embers of the sphere's core, an immense host of soaring figures appeared as if coming from a great distance. In a moment, they were above Eruita's lines and, in the next, had driven towards the regrouping warriors of Haarken's gloom talons. Infantry and mechanized elements of the Worldclaimer's host still advanced on Eruita's lines, but the new arrivals drove back the raptors and winged demon engines. They were sisters of battle, Seraphim and Zephyrim, as well as flocks of winged Sovo cherubs and snow-feathered doves. At their head, leading the charge north into Haarken's warriors, was Celestine, the living saint. The voice stifled. To the northeast of the Flare Scar, in the Munitorum district, the fight for the orbital weapons of the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery ground on. Striding to the end of the Guardians of the Covenant, Princeps Drentor's Titan Maniple began harassing fire the moment House Mandracore rear guard came within extreme range, as the Legio Tempestor god engines circumvented the Scar's northern edge. Though the veteran pilots of Mandracore employed their steeds' ion shields and agility to great effect, some were still annihilated by fire from Drentor's warlord, Thunderlord Lyzades, and its accompanying Reavers, Joggars, and Cerulean Stride. Highborn Plotting. At the forefront of the attack against the Guardians of the Covenant, Baron Commodore and Countess Caliganus were never far from each other's side. She monitored his commands, looking for betrayal or weakness. For his part, Commodore kept just as much an eye on the Countess. As they reached the outer battery districts, they smashed through it together, obliterating pockets of resistance. Commodore felt his suspicion bleed away in the thrill of destruction as he and Caliganus engaged in a fierce rivalry. Time and again, Commodore roared challenges and oaths through his knight's emitters. He proclaimed the superiority of House Mandracore and drove his fallen nobles onwards with death threats if they failed to uphold the house's honor. It is all a carefully modulated display. Commodore saw in the Countess's furious fighting and how she relayed some of his orders that she desired command. She was a High Monarch's daughter, but she was far down the line of succession. Power would only come if she took it. Commodore spoke to her over a private Vox channel as they fought, about his ambitions for House Mandracore, of its self-imposed isolation, and how together they could lift it into a dynasty to be feared. Battle and bloodshed drew the two closer, and Caliganus listened intently as she killed. Master Nardeth's armoured support, including a mixed formation of storm speeders and predators, powered around the Chaos Knight's southern flank to bring their anti-tank capabilities into killing range. Outrider squadrons accelerated straight into the Traitors' teeth, sheer speed their defense. Interrogator Chaplain Sorion led the Outriders in encircling assaults and point-blank firefights, his amplified oratory steeling his battle brother's spirits against the roiling miasma of spiritual dread that swept ahead of the Chaos Knights. They aimed crippling shots and strikes at the war engine's few, less armoured joints. Only 2 of House Mandracore's War Dog-class steeds fell, but the Outriders' attacks kept many fallen nobles' attention engaged to allow the Demi-Company's armour column to close from the flank. At the Dreadlance's tip, Chaos Knights pushed on towards the main forces of Nardeth's Guardians of the Covenant. Towering war engines thundered into the munition shrines, and calibrated temples they clung to the western precincts of the Grand Battery. They traded volleys of furious firepower with squads of Demi-Company Vol, losing 2 of their number to concentrated plasma missiles before flattening the buildings themselves with cannon fire and swipes of their gigantic blades, driving the surviving Space Marines back. The rest, led by Baron Commodore and Countess Caliganus, closed on the Guardians of the Covenant's rearguard infantry positions at the southwestern precincts of the orbital guns. Despite the nearing Legio Tempestor allies and the counterattacks by Nardeth's warriors, the battle was finally telling upon the Guardians of the Covenant and sorely testing their resolve. The structures at the heart of the Grand Battery were a tangle of ceramite-skinned observation bunkers, plascrete blast shields, and traceries of transit gantries that overhung the great cratered bowl of the orbital gun's firing pit. Here the rest of Demi-Company Vol fought to hold back the demons of Trokan. The warp spawn boiled from the ruined northern precincts, their unnatural resilience on the brink of overcoming the Space Marines' grim stoicism. Packs of keening demonettes and grotesque fiends rushed Nardeth's defenders. At the same time, horrors hurled storms of mutagenic warp fire that reduced disciplined Guardians of the Covenant to screaming embers or transformed them into writhing masses of flesh. Master Nardeth fought like a mythic knight within the heart of the Grand Battery's support structures, bringing down infernal entities with his bolt carbine and smashing apart the unflesh of any demon that dared come within range of his power fist. All the while, the Master of the Third Company monitored the battle through the entire Grand Battery, some precincts of which were over a mile distant from his position. His battle brothers were holding their own, but the demon's supernatural might had prevented the Guardians of the Covenant from advancing to protect the guns. A quintet of soul grinders reached the northernmost orbital gun and tore it apart in spurts of flaming ichor and repeated blows from their warp claws. Several of House Mandracore's leading Chaos Knights smashed through the western precincts, striding straight over Nardreth's battle brothers to reach the nearest gigantic laser. In moments, they brought it crashing down against another. Master Nardreth saw no victory to be won at the Grand Battery. The orbital guns were lost. His warriors had endured horrific dread and empiric insanity, as well as the heinous guns and claws of traitors and demons. There were other battles to be fought, if not within Urbana Sprawl Alpha, then across the Sanguiterra. After voxing his intent to Junith Eruita's command staff, Nardreth ordered Demi Company Vor to fall back. His infantry exfiltrated from the southern precincts, joining Sorion's Outriders and the armoured squadron. Behind them, what was left of the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery burned. Hope and doubt. Celestine and her angelic host met the Worldclaimer's raptors in a swirling and furious confrontation of close-range firepower and hate-filled blade work. The Living Saints' highly mobile force held Haarken's roving killers back from Eruita's battle lines long enough for the 5th Preceptory to establish their positions in front of the Prefectus Bastion complex. Yet the Battle Sisters' efforts were hampered. Haarken's mechanized infantry and battle tanks, following up in secondary and tertiary ways in the Raptors' wake, had pushed on from the Akrandor spaceport and skirted their master's fight against the Living Saint to attack the Prefectus Bastion from the north. Having overrun the scattered Imperial Guard resistance, the Night Lord's armoured elements pushed from the southwest to hammer Eruita's rallying troops with enfilading fire. Inquisitor Carter Valonus came to his own conclusion that Urbana Sprawl Alpha was lost. Despite Cariness Eruita's orders to consolidate back onto the Prefectus Bastion and dig in, the Inquisitor instead took to the encrypted voxnets of his black iconoclasts. He used every measure of his inquisitorial authority, and no small amount of threat, to order in flights of dropships for immediate evacuation. The Living Saint plummeted, holding the ardent blade point down in two hands. She met the Black Legion Raptor as he launched skyward, her descent too fast for the tainted warrior to evade. Celestine's blade pierced the brow of his horned helm, skewering his head, chest, and spine in an impact that drove him down against the glare of his jump pack and through his scattering squad. The heretic's jump pack died too, as the ardent blade was driven through the warrior's back, and holy energy severed some vital mechanism. The dead raptor landed first, with enough force to break his bones. Celestine alighted a second later, the flames from her winged pack scouring the corpse before cutting out. Righteous anger surged through Celestine. She glanced around, taking in the swirl of noise and death. Death so fleet and merciless, it seemed nothing could ever outrun it. Celestine's surprise attack had driven the Black Legion's advance guard north into a huge swathe of partly demolished Hab precincts. Celestine had yet to absorb the complete strategic picture of the battle she had plunged into, but she had lifetimes of experience in such swift prioritization. Vox chatter suggested that the warriors of St. Catherine's Order were in peril. Celestine knew she was here to deliver them. She moved on, gathering more data with every stride, every flashing sword stroke seeing another heretic laid low. Her host raced and bounded over a swathe of partly demolished Hab precincts north of the Prefectus Bastion. At first, her sister's assault had swept the foe away from Cariness Eruita's lines, but the fight had sharpened into a new shape as the traitors used the broken ruins for cover and countless spiteful counterattacks. Seraphim dropped from the skies with pistols stitching unremitting streams of explosive bolts and tongues of holy flame. They bounded away again almost as soon as they landed, on arcing trajectories to gain new firing positions. Nearby, Zephyrim squads raced through forests of crumbling walls before lancing upwards to strike at packs of raptors in mid-air. Close-range firefights swept back and forth, the clash of blades, the amplified snarls of the heretics and uplifting roar of psalm fragments, the blood and arrow-fast shadows of airborne warriors, all darted and swam around Celestine and far overhead. Through it all, though, Celestine concentrated on a single voice. She had heard it in the first seconds at a distance, castigating and condemning in overpowering tones of the darkest blasphemy. She did not care who the voice belonged to, only that it had to be cut from this world like a splinter. Celestine sprinted forward up an incline of collapsed walls and dead warriors, her life wards and several squads of Zephyrim only a few paces behind. She leapt from the top, a sweep of fire from her pack's vents propelling her to the upper floor of a shattered hab block. The living saint saw the warrior then atop a neighbouring tower. Fighting at the front of several squads of raptors, he slashed open her sisters with the talons of one hand or impaled them with a hideous spear clutched in the other. Darkness roiled around the warrior like the voluminous wings of some chiropteran predator. Warp filth bled from his spear. Many warriors were around him, but the living saint's gaze didn't shift. Celestine activated the Vox amplifier in her armor as she raced up the hab block's orphaned stairway to gain greater height and speed. When she called out, her voice was the clarion boom of 1,000 trumpets. "Cast down the heretics! Let none live that tarnish this sacred realm! For the God Emperor!" She leapt. In her stream of fire, her warriors leapt after her. They powered into the melee like celestial comets. Celestine pitched the first raptor over the hab block's side. She cleaved the next in two, her blade trailing fire. She and her sisters battled through the bodyguards, death mounting on both sides. The heretic had seen her. He barged past the nearest raptors, sweeping Seraphim aside with his talons as he fought to reach her. A blow knocked her hard to one side. Celestine tasted blood. She looked to her left, saw a shorn rise of masonry, and looked back at the heretic champion. He had seen her look, and was already powering towards the high ground. Celestine reached it first. She swung into a fighting stance, but in the movement, from this position, she had beheld Eruita's lines. They were buckling anew and shrinking. The flanks of the Canoness's defences were failing. Celestine saw what would happen. They would take heart from their martyrdom, fighting on, but more Black Legion were already moving to engulf them. It would be a massacre. The heretic was swooping towards her, its talons outstretched. She stepped off the precipice, igniting her jump pack to steer back towards Eruita. Compassion drove her, tearing her from the righteous slaying. The heretic's death would come, that she vowed. But it was no less a duty to the God Emperor as she powered south to save Eruita's warriors. Serenity and Duty. The attack by Celestine's angelic host had been unforeseen by either Eruita or Haarken. The living saint's assault had blunted the invaders' onslaught against the Prefector's bastion, but the battle hung in the balance. With her Gemini superior and a small number of Zephyrim as an honor guard, Celestine sped along the ruinous trail of destruction left in the wake of Haarken's armoured squadrons, infantry companies, packs of shambling chaos spawn, and squads of possessed. She circled the force's southern flank, reaching a fraying edge of Eruita's defensive lines as they attempted to hold back one brutal assault after another. The north of the Canoness's lines were already fighting to the death, held in face by faith and loyalty, but looking on the verge of being wiped out to Celestine's experienced eye. Haarken's capture of the Akrandor spaceport had allowed him to bring in heavier assault elements. What had begun as 2 waves of reinforcements had become a flood, as his well-planned use of the landing fields saw touchdowns and relaunches orchestrated to disgorge one warband after another. These he hurled at the flagging Adepta Sororitas lines, defending the Prefector's bastion without pause. The threat of being outflanked effectively pinned Eruita's command in place and forced her to call up the very last reinforcements she had so far kept back within the Bastion's walls. Haarken had gambled that his foes' fanaticism would see them fight on when pragmatism demanded they retreat. Now his calculated risk was borne out. These more powerful warbands provided Haarken a mean to consolidate and secure gains made by his gloom talons, and ensured that the number of Black Legion throughout the sprawl considerably outnumbered those of any of his lieutenants. The Worldclaimer did not doubt that they were loyal to Abaddon, but flooding the sprawl with Black Legionaries ensured it would be his to gift to the Despoiler, and none other. A mission of survival. Celestine reached Eruita's position near the center of the Canoness's lines. At that point, the 5th Preceptory of the Order of Armada Lady had been pushed back to the outer curtain wall and battlements of the Prefectus Bastion. She discovered that Eruita had pulled more and more reserve forces out of the interior of the Didactos Palace and Officio Munitorum Fortress, taking them to hold the Bastion battlements at the southwest against the Night Lords of the Chainflare, and in the northwest to reinforce her own fight against Haarken's Black Legion. Few war leaders would have granted any form of pause in battle by the incendiary canoness to petition another stratagem. However, Celestine's legend amongst the Order of Armada Lady was of the most holy of living warriors. Her blazing sword of divine vengeance, the miracle of her manifestation in Sanguiterra's hour of need, her being clad in the blood-spattered armor of St. Catherine herself. Any one of these would have drawn Eruita to halt and hear the warrior's words. As Eruita's battle sisters held the line against their inexorable Black Legion, Celestine advanced on the Canoness Superior like a vengeful angel. Eruita was awed at first by her presence, but Celestine's words of censure hit her hard. The living saint acknowledged that Eruita's stand at Urbanospor Alpha would fell many more heretics before they were overcome, but they would be overcome. Celestine spoke from her soul when she recited from the Catechism of Selflessness that the God Emperor's servants were not made to judge their own death's worth, for only he had that right. A worthy martyrdom was rightly praised, she told Eruita, but a wasteful death did naught but the enemy's work for them. Celestine vowed loudly that she would not die vaingloriously, but live to fight on in the Emperor's service. Anger and humiliation warred in the Canoness's heart, but the pronouncement had come from the living saint herself, and Eruita knew that they were divinely inspired. When Celestine told the Canoness to call in an extraction, that she might fight for this world again and reap a greater tally of traitor heads, all knew she was asking the notoriously uncompromising Eruita to escape rather than die here. Whatever rebuttals might have risen in Eruita's throat in earlier wars, she did not voice. With a last furious look in the traitor's direction, she moved to action the living saint's guidance. Celestine took command of a small portion of the 5th Preceptory, those already almost surrounded at the north of Eruita's lines. Eruita pulled as much of her remaining forces as possible from the Prefectus Bastion, merging them with her own. Senior officers, tech magi from the Officio Militarum Fortress, and battle conclaves led by the surviving clergy of the Cathedral of the Pyre Deified joined them. Many within the Bastion requested permission to remain behind. They would coordinate those of its defenders, especially those still fighting the Night Lords, who would never reach Eruita's 5th Preceptory and salvation in time. They vowed to delay the invaders as long as possible, and to make them bleed for every tower, cloister, and logisticarum cell the traitors set foot in. With her numbers swelled one final time, Eruita executed the first stage of her plan. Several assaults, small but precise, by her veterans, gave a fleeting impression to the Black Legion of a spearhead attempt to the northwest, as if the battle sisters had mustered their strength into a futile offensive. When the heretic line stiffened and braced to throw the battle sisters back, the Canoness sent the signal that saw almost her entire force suddenly disengage and break away to the southeast. Celestine and her honor guard reached the near-surrounded northern edge of Eruita's defenders. Her host of Seraphim and Zephyrim had succeeded in pushing Haarken's raptors further north into the bombarded ruins. Celestine now recalled them to her side, merging them with those of Junith's warriors under her command, leading them in a furious rearguard action to secure the Canoness's fighting retreat. Eruita had designated a large region on both sides of the Flare Scar as the most favourable extraction point. A delegation of Sisters Dialogus, amongst those who had reached the Canoness from the Officio Militarum fortress, relayed precision extraction corals through the fortress's still-staffed Vox Shrine. They also reached out to as many commanders as they could throughout Urbana Sprawl Alpha, hoping to spread the order and allow as many able fighters as possible the chance of vengeance elsewhere. Haarken Worldclaimer's invasion of Urbana Sprawl Alpha could not now be halted. However, there was a whole world and countless other battlefields to fight over before Sanguiterra fell totally. Pragmatism and Passions. Master Nardreth's retreat southward had been swift and conducted in good order. Alongside Interrogator Chaplain Sorion, his surviving outriders and the remains of Nardreth's rapid armoured column, their tarnished silver transports bore all the remaining battle brothers down the eastern edge of the Flare Scar. They were pursued by many of House Mandracore's Chaos Knights, whose long strides ate up the miles almost as swiftly as Nardreth's vehicles. Baron Commodar and Countess Caliganus, satisfied that the destruction of the orbital guns was already assured, had hungrily led their fallen noble kin after the Guardians of the Covenant. Yet Nardreth's retreat was no panicked flight, but rather a cleverly layered fighting withdrawal, and the fallen nobles of Mandracore had overstretched themselves in their eagerness. The Guardians of the Covenant battle tanks split as they moved south into agile formations that loosed devastating shots to cover their fellows' retreat before roaring onwards and being covered by the others. A handful of Mandracore's war dogs who had approached Nardreth's demi-company too closely fell in crumpled ruin and engine detonations, and 2 of Commodore's senior bonded kin were exterminated by concentrated laser, missile, and melter beam fire. It was now that Nardreth's Vox unit picked up and decrypted the evacuation order from Junith Eruita. His battle brothers had borne the stultifying dread of House Mandracore's hunters and had made them pay dearly for their sport. They had stood through supernatural insanity and warp fire as creatures from the Immaterium peeled apart their comrades' armor and souls. A lesser commander might have resented enduring such hardships only to flee, might even have blamed the retreat on their allies and assumed weakness or ineptitude on their part. Nardreth was no such fool. He had no doubt Eruita's survivors had faced similarly terrible odds themselves, and if the Canoness Superior had ordered the retreat, she would have done so only for the soundest of strategic reasons. With his demi-company soul-weary and low on ammunition, Nardreth contacted his own reserves of gunships for extraction, timing their arrival to coincide with Eruita's. The Guardians of the Covenant would rearm and regroup before striking anew to continue their defense of Sanguiterra. The world was not short of battlefields. Chorkan's demonic legions had overrun the burning remnants of the orbital guns, only to come under fire from the Princeps Drentor's god engines. The Titans had not stopped in their pursuit of House Mandracore's renegades, but nearing the battery's ruin, the Legio's honor demanded an outpouring of wrath. A thunder of massive shells, volleys of missiles, and lancing energy beams smashed into the demons. Protoplasmic flesh, unnatural bone, and demonic ichor boiled into nothingness in the firestorm. It was not nearly enough. Most of the demons shrugged off the barrage with eldritch resistance. Without the pain or terrors of mortals, the unnatural tide of empiric entities erupted from the battery's precincts to intercept the Legio Tempestor's maniple. Prevented from closing with the Chaos Knights by the mass of nightmarish apparitions boiling towards them, Drentor and his fellow Princeps bade their god engines brace. The Warhorns, a thunderlord like Saides, led a deafening challenge from the Legio Tempestor Titans as they unleashed their entire arsenals upon Chorkan's demonic horde. Wings of Deliverance. The eastern and western border zones of the Flare Scar spread almost a half-mile back from its central chasm. These areas were suicidally hazardous, strung with pockets of empiric instability, pools of empathic toxins, and the haunts of semi-corporeal predators. In making for the area with an enemy at her back, Eruita knew that she risked trapping those she had hoped to save, but her options were limited. A stretch of the western Scriptorum district, before it gave onto the Flare Scar, was Eruita's planned evacuation site. Multiple broad plazas surrounded by crumbling scribe cell blocks, surrounded by their inhabitants as they fled the horror of the Scar, would provide adequate landing fields for the aerial transports she had called in. The site was the only one Eruita and her advisors believed they could reach in time. Through choppy vox static, Loyalist officers responded from across the urban sprawl, vowing to make the coordinates or pleading for more time to get their scattered soldiery to safety. Privately, Eruita began to worry that whatever evacuation assets could reach her coordinates might not be enough to airlift all the forces she hoped to salvage. Some of the traitors' bombardments had inadvertently widened plazas and rendered them more suitable for aerial evacuation, but with enemies on her heels, it was time she needed more than anything. Part of Haarken's Black Legion focused on conquering the Prefectus Bastion, but Haarken dispatched a hunting formation of mechanized infantry to pursue Eruita. The Worldclaimer himself oversaw the takeover of the Bastion complex. Haarken had weighed Eruita's value as a trophy, and the damage she could do if allowed to reach another sprawl and rallying support. But the equipment and data inside Eruita's stratagem, and the symbolism in claiming the world's capital, was too great a prize to entrust to other champions. Most of the Night Lords peeled off from attacking the complex when they detected Eruita's retreat and hungrily tore after her forces, racing the Black Legion for the kill. The Chaos forces would have easily caught and overwhelmed Eruita's evacuating force during their race south had it not been for the Living Saint. She and the Battle Sisters under her command fought in Eruita's wake with furious zeal. Dominion squads in arrowheads of rhinos and immolators intercepted Black Legion armor columns, the Sisters leaping out under heavy covering fire to bring melter guns and thrice-blessed crack grenades to bear at close range. Zephyrim and Seraphim worked in tandem to hunt the predatory raptors of the Night Lords, forcing them back amidst righteous volleys of bolt fire before lancing into their midst and striking the traitors down. Celestine fought as the rearguard's linchpin. She was a fiery thunderbolt of divine wrath. She slew Chaos champions in aerial duels and immolated monstrous heretics with spears of holy flame. She was gravely wounded, bleeding from multiple cuts, and her skin blistered with fire, but she led her warriors to cut off every attempt by the enemy to surge past Eruita's force. Celestine's sisters were outnumbered and outgunned, and she rallied them to her position again and again, keeping them on the move and denying the enemy any chance to trap and overwhelm them. Many fell nonetheless. To the north, the Titans of the Legio Tempestor were being overwhelmed. The Princeps Drentor knew his maniple would not reach the extraction point. The Chaos Knights of House Mandragore, unable to keep pace with the retreat of the Guardians of the Covenant, had turned back. The fallen nobles unleashed a thunderous firestorm on the Titans as they closed with them. Trukan's demons had swamped the god engines, weakening them with blades and supernatural energies, and bringing down their few remaining void shields amidst eruptions of kaleidoscopic lightning. The Reaver, Cerulean Stride, was brought to its knees as the couplings crumbled with empiric corrosion. Cho'Gaz shuddered to a standstill as demons broke through its plating to butcher its screaming crew. The Chaos Knights blew their war horns, warning their demonic allies away from a kill they saw as theirs, but they were ignored. A huge bloodthirster flew through Thunderlord Lixardi's point defense cannons to crash into its head section, hacking through its armor to get to those inside. Princeps Drentor ordered the Warlord's reactor to maximum and unshackled its shielding. With a curse at the demon as it reached for him, he detonated the Titan's core. On both flanks of the Flare Scar, Imperial dropships in many forms and liveries finally streaked in. Armored lighters, freight landers, and gunships bristling with heavy weapons braved a deluge of fire from the Black Legion and Night Lords as they swooped into the extraction points. Eruita's Battle Sisters, Imperial Guardsmen, and surviving adepts in the west, and Master Nardreth's Battle Brothers in the east, boarded one flight after another as squadrons of interceptors and fighter bombers scoured the extraction zones to allow as many as possible to escape. The last gunship. Celestine and the few remaining survivors of her heroic rearguard reached the extraction coordinates as the last of Eruita's command were being lifted clear. With a simultaneous signal to the interceptor and fighter pilots above, she led her sisters to the last dropships as they touched down. Celestine's aerial support tore apart the nearest enemies, churning the ground with solid shot, missiles and laser fire to give her warriors time to get clear. Barely a dozen of the 5th Preceptory's northern defenders still lived. Those who made it to the dropships wore expressions of calm serenity on their scarred and bloody features. Great gouges and gory craters marred their battle plate. Celestine herself was the last to board the final dropship. Its cannon screamed as it fired during liftoff, tearing apart a squad of baying legionaries that raced to reach it even as the ramp closed. The living saint's left arm was broken, hanging limply at her side. Charred and blistered skin covered one side of her face, and blood seeped from countless wounds, the pools of it on the gunship's deck plates, much later being reverentially collected in crystal vials. There remained battles to fight and faithful servants of the God Emperor to rally and inspire. She would not leave until her duty was done. Haarken Worldclaimer paced around the primary strategem of the former Officio Militarum fortress, Hellspear gripped tightly in one hand. What had been Junith Eruita's command chamber was now his. The corpses of the last defenders littered the room. Uniforms and robes of office hung from them, torn and bloody, the gore overpowering the residue of incense in the chamber. Blast shutters had been cracked in the chamber's southern wall, allowing the smell of blood and incense to seep outside. Through them, Haarken could see clouds of dust thrown up into the air that marked the recent destruction of the Cathedral of the Pyre deified. Around the Worldclaimer, Black Legion's serfs and servitors, monitored by warpsmith Corendis, toiled at repairs or dragged bodies away, while around a cracked hololith table in the strategem's center waited the other Chaos Lords pivotal in the capital's capture. Corendis had reported to Haarken that the repairs to the strategem would take many labor cycles and his personal oversight. Besides the damage caused during its capture, some of the tech magi and officers who had remained to defend it had attempted to inflict physical and datasphere mutilation. Self-replicating kill codes and auto-deletion protocols had been intended to sour what might otherwise have been an ideal asset conquest. They had not been quick enough. Corendis, his cyberthurgic underlings, some of the Dark Magi Commodar had brought from Ordrex Darg, plus their stables of subservient infogeists, had been able to stem most of the damage before it compromised the value of what Haarken sought. The Worldclaimer took in the rest of the strategem. Toppled columns, smashed hololith projectors, and charred flesh marred the view for now, but it would serve as he needed it to. The hololith projectors were being shrivened of uncooperative machine spirits, and slabs of blood-stained megalith connected to them with biochemical ducting. Freshly hewn skulls adorned alcoves that had once borne statuettes of saints. Everywhere the Imperial Aquila was defaced, gouged away, or defiled. New cogitator cores inhabited by warp-spawned data-djinn had been hauled into place. Other machines took the place of damaged or compromised logic engines, the replacements bearing not even an inherent association with those pulled away for sacrificial disassembly. Then there was his special device. Its lower half was hidden, where it lurked near the strategem's rear. Breathy rasps and wet gurgles came from it. Haarken slowed his pace as he finally turned to address the gathered lords. At his barest glance in Corendis' direction, the warpsmith nodded and adjusted a dial on his armored cuff. The serfs all spasmed painfully in unison. They and the silent servitors scurried or shambled out, Corendis herding them back to whatever oil-slick pit he had claimed for his own in the once fortress. Only now, with the strategem denuded of menials, did the Worldclaimer look directly at those surrounding him. With a helmet at his belt, his face was bare, and his eyes did not blink. They were commanders of one warband or another, fallen nobles, dark magi, demonologists, void captains, or regimental commanders. Most attended in person. Some flickered above hastily entreated hololith emitters. The strangest was a thing of darkness through which Chorkan attended. Its envoy was a demon of hooks and beaks, arms and spines, gill-like ribbing and teeth. Everything about it seethed with a vapour of midnight blue one moment, the black of the void the next, magenta charred flesh to ash, or oily onyx scales. This sprawl, this world's capital, belongs to Abaddon, Haarken began. When the War Master chooses to finally end Sanguine Terror at his leisure, its death will be traced to this sprawl. This is the cut that starved the brain, the talon thrust that blinded the eye. Haarken turned his head slowly. It was not as Abaddon would pass information, not as Abaddon would rule. Haarken would lower himself to ape the Despoiler's greatness. He was Abaddon's voice here, and he wanted those present to know that their master's voice could come from anywhere. Urbanus Spore Thetis, the Marilon span, the Devas beacons, and 70 more knots of the false Emperor's curs have been cut away from the planet's flesh. But this was the battle that mattered. The stratagems in this fortress fed the weaklings' logicians across the northern hemisphere. The fallen cathedral, he gestured out of the blast shutters to the south, nourished the hope of billions. The palace, pointing west, was a means of tying the world to the voice of the dead tyrant of terror. He paused for 3 strides, watching for glances, nods, curled lips, any hidden pact. They knew what they had won, or thought they did. They waited to hear what they would get for it, and where the War Master wanted them next. Some still didn't like the choice not being theirs. All of you are to be rewarded with a measure of your deeds. Slaves, weapons, ships, data. Haarken turned his head to the demon, enough so all could see. Rare bounties and more. So wills the War Master. But there were others in the War Master's trust whose failure stretches back. In a brushstroke so wide that it was obvious to all, they foolishly sought to eclipse the War Master. Haarken plucked the helmet from his belt and flung it, so it bounced and skidded over the hololith table. The assembled warriors knew at once it wasn't Haarken's. When it came to rest, all saw it had belonged to Lord Vyax, once commander of the Crimson Claw. The last they had heard, he had been sent to lead the attack on the spires of Urbanus Spore Thetis against the Orcs, expecting resistance but determined to prevail. However, what had damaged his helm bore no signs of Orcoid weaponry. It was misshapen as if partially slagged, but portions bulged. Others were wrinkled, segments pulled and twisted and made wrong. Vyax's helmet had carried no macabre facial expression before, the Dark Warrior scorning such ornamentation. It carried one now. Every warlord saw the agony of Vyax's face shaped into the helmet's surface. The stuff of his body and soul had been played with. Every scrap of who he had once been wrung out of it in a way he had felt. The only thing that was unchanged from the day it had been applied was the sigil of Chorkan upon the brow. The assembled warlords glanced at each other, at Haarken, and finally at the shadow demon. A rainbow-hued grin of needle fangs split the creature from side to side, then another vertically. Several eyes opened in the emissary demon's form as Chorkan gazed back. At least 2 huge faces pushed at the emissary demon's flesh from within. They gave a high-pitched hum of satiation. Several of the warlords later swore they recognized some of the eyes as belonging to those who had borne the sigil. None of those individuals were present. "You gave them to this demon?" Nestar's whisper was like a hiss, but Haarken saw half a smile behind the affront. "All of them?" "They gave themselves," he roared back, "when they dared put their wills before the War Masters!" With his point made, the price for Chorkan's aid revealed, and, Haarken hoped, a lesson that would be hard to forget etched into the warlord's memories, the Worldclaimer moved to other matters. He outlined his plans to establish a new front for the invasion across the Kuralis Delta, assigning for the strongest remaining urban explorers of the Northern Hemisphere to be crushed, their defiance and survival to be made examples of. He assigned the most important of the Southern Hemisphere's targets to several in the room, taking none for his own forces, reinforcing that he saw the matter of betrayal as over. Haarken dismissed the warlords after giving them their orders. They stalked out, and the emissary demon's form bubbled down into nothing. His mind turned to matters of greater scope, and he moved towards the cluttered chamber's rear. The Worldclaimer thought of the Sanguis system, and the occupying demon lord on its moon. He thought of the connections the Imperium thought of as its strengths, hooking one system's flesh to another with communications, trade, logistics, faith, and more. The ticking of cogitators old and new, cycling generatoriums and sizzling runes, added to the rhythms of his thoughts. He considered the systems of the Sanctus Wall, of their place within the Gandal Subsector, itself nestled within its own sector, and the command echelons that fed meaning each to the other. He envisioned a complex brass orrery and smiled cruelly as, in his mind's eye, it ran with blood. Where Abaddon had asked for a foothold, Haarken would gift him the entire sector. The gurgling hisses of the devices at the strategem's rear grew louder as Haarken approached. It was not intentionally kept secret, but it had been placed out of sight, as Haarken considered its appearance too distracting to his commanders to be on show. A biological mass was melded to the device's concave face. Wires and pipes perforated it in patterns that owed much of their design to Nethtar sorcerers. Dangling loops of knotted flesh like cauliflower pearls on lengths of tanned hide connected the stumps of brown teeth. Fleshy sacs quivered, some appearing barely stable and fit to burst, others like hardened gelatine stretched tight over clusters of knuckles. Organ fragments, gristle, and lank strands of grey hair were stitched together, drawn up in folds around one eye. Runes were tattooed in profusion over the flesh, in metals and blood and ground bone. You will help me reach inside Sector Command. The knowledge still inside you. Your ciphers, Nemo codes, names, numbers, and plans will unlock one door after another, until this sector serves the War Master. What was left of Lord Admiral Priska's mind understood a little of what Haarken had said. The movement of air as the Worldclaimer left rippled through a flap of skin and past what was left of her larynx, drawing forth the echo of a moan. End quote. If you have enjoyed this reading, then don't forget to like, subscribe, share the video, and, if you are feeling bountiful, possibly sling me a groat via Patreon or Super Thanks. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.